The next type of control we'll be looking at is the pop-up palette. The pop-up palette can be found as one of these long gray boxes with text inside and a black arrow that points downward. And this is used to change the setting for the property that it changes. As you can see here, we have edge type, and by selecting a different setting, it changes the way that the effect appears on the layer. The problem with the pop-up palette is that if we select it for animation, you can see that I get this keyframe here that's a box, and since we've gone over keyframes, we know that this box here is the symbol for a hold keyframe. So if I were to select a different setting, you can see that it goes to that setting, but if I were to actually see the animation, it will hold this keyframe until its next setting is reached. So we can't actually animate an in-between for the settings of the pop-up palette. The next control we'll be taking a look at is called the effect point. And the effect point can be found by this little icon here, which looks like a target, and two numerics next to it that stand for the X and Y axis. If I drag these similar to the slider, you'll notice that there's a point here in the composition window, and this is the actual effect point. And what this does is this is the point where that property actually affects the layer. So when I move this, you'll notice how the effect moves depending on the position of the effect point. And I can use the X and Y sliders here in order to move this, or I can click and drag in the actual timeline composition window, only if I can see the actual effect point though. If the effect point isn't visible, I can simply select this target tool here, and you'll see that I can just click and select a point, and the effect point will move to that position. We'll be using these to control how the effect actually applies to the layer, and some effects will use more than one effect point. Such as when we're using the lightning or the audio, it will have a beginning effect point and an ending effect point. Now we'll go on to options and switches. You'll see here that we have evolution options, and these aren't actually the options that I'm talking about. These are actually just subsets of properties for another property. The options would actually appear here between the reset and the about on the same line as the name of the effect. You can see here that this roughen edges doesn't have any options, but this basic text does. It would normally say options in this area, but because it's a text layer, it says edit text. And when we use the options control, we would simply click on it, and it would bring up a window that told us we needed to enter in some sort of information. Here we can enter text and the styles of the text because it's a text layer. If we were using a normal other type of effect that had the options here, if we clicked that, it would more than likely bring us to a file menu window where we would have to select the file that pertain to that type of effect. Turn this off here. The switch for control, you'll see here that I have this property here that can't be turned on, or that can't be actually modified, and that's because one of the options, or the actual switch for that property, has been turned off. Here I turned it on, and now we can adjust this if we wanted to. And this is one of the subset properties that I was telling you about. Here we usually have underneath one of the properties a set of properties, and usually there's a switch underneath that property in order to turn on certain subset properties that affect the main property. The last type of control that we'll be talking about is called the custom interface object. Actually, what these are is sometimes we'll use a plugin or an effect that we didn't originally get from After Effects, and most of the time these plugins will have their own type of interface within the effect control palette. And usually the effect control is pretty self-explanatory. As you can see here, this histogram works very similar to slider bars using their markers. And if we want to know what the effect actually does, we can go up here into the About, and you'll see it'll bring up a window that tells us what the effect actually does. And for some other effects that we get that aren't included with After Effects, we can usually look here to see how we would control their custom interface, or we can read in the but this is just a group of all the types of controls that don't fall within the other categories of the sliders or dials, but usually they're fairly easy to use and come with instructions in the About area or in the README for the actual plugin or effect.